So, welcome back to Philosophy 1102, Introduction to Philosophy. Okay, so in the readings, we noticed that we focused a lot on the problem of evil. And the Warburton reading, I'll start with that, and then I'll go into the Phaser reading. So you have human evil, right? It's just apparent. What are some examples of human evil? Holocaust, right. What is the Holocaust? There's time in the war in Nazi Germany. The Nazis took Jews in particular, but a lot of different people from different types of backgrounds that they thought were not good, or they thought that were from a inferior, they felt were inferior, the Nazis did. And they took those people and slaughtered them in various ways and tortured them. And millions of Jews died, almost I think their goal was genocide, which is the extermination of the Jews. I think of what happened with the Japanese invasion of China with the Nanjing, right? That would be an example of human evil, a mass amount of murder and horrible, horrible things that were committed. What are some other examples? Torture, right. And that goes on even today. Even today, torture is used. Even though many governments try to deny it, it still happens. What other examples? Murder. Yeah. What are some examples of evil that happen but maybe aren't as extreme? Maybe they're not as bad as those things, but they could be on a smaller scale. Maybe even some of us sometimes do these things. Maybe they're not. You don't think of them as like horrible, like you're not killing anyone, but maybe you've even done some things that actually we could consider evil. And we're going to actually talk about this next week. I know you don't have to admit it. Maybe it could be other people. You could say what other people have done, and it's not as extreme. We're going to talk about good and bad next week when we talk about ethics. But this is probably a good place to start. And you can ask this question: is cheating on a test? Is that a kind of evil? Could we say is cheating? Okay. Here's an example. You're with your friends, and there's one person. Maybe he's not your favorite friend, and you want to have lunch with your other friends, but this other person, you say to him, he says, "Oh, where are you going?" And you say to him, "Oh, I'm just going, to the store." But really, you're going to have lunch with your other friends, and you're lying. Yeah, basically lying, and you're actually not just lying, but you're also excluding this person, right? You're keeping him from coming to lunch with you. Is that evil? It's positive lying? Okay. But what about if he finds out later that you didn't invite him to come? But so what I'm trying to say is there is a broad range of things from the very worst of crimes that could ever be committed to just, maybe some kind of a little bit of lying and a little bit of excluding people and a little bit of meanness that we can see in humans. And so why does this all exist, right? That's the question. So there's also natural or metaphysical. So these are the two types of evil. There's a natural or metaphysical evil. What are some examples of the natural kind of evil? Earthquake, right. So what else? What else do we have for flood? Yeah. What would be a natural evil? So all these things, natural disasters, very easy to think of examples. So the question is then, how could a benevolent God, you guys know the word benevolent, it means good, kind, gracious, wonderful, doing what is good for all of mankind. How could such a God allow such evil? These horrible things that happen, both humans committing such terrible atrocities, like the Holocaust, like the rape of Nanjing, and disasters, natural disasters, where there's earthquakes, where there's hurricanes, where all these things happen. How could that happen?
Maybe he wants to control the balance of good and evil.
Okay, maybe he wants to balance the good and evil. So kind of in Chinese, right? Chinese philosophy, you have the yin and the yang, right? Oops, that's not very good. The yin and yang, and he needs to bring the balance. So you're going to have on this side, maybe this is the dark, right? This is the yin, and there needs to be a little bit of the white there, and this one is a little bit black in the white. So you have the yin and the yang, right? So maybe he needs to make a balance. Okay. But wouldn't an all-powerful God be able to stop evil? Wouldn't he be able to say, okay, I'm all-powerful, and I am just going to stop the evil, right? Wouldn't he be able to? What is the meaning of this question? The question means that if God is all-powerful, right, then he would have the power to stop evil, right? He would not have the power to stop evil. At least that's what we can assume. So why can't he just use his power that way? Why can't he just make evil stop?
Maybe he afraid something.
Maybe he's afraid of something. So then if he's afraid of something, then he doesn't seem very all-powerful, right?
He's powerful enough.
So somehow there's something that doesn't seem right about that, right?
Maybe he just didn't want to care about it.
Maybe he didn't want to care, but then maybe he's not so all good. So that's the next question. Wouldn't an all good God want to stop evil? Why wouldn't?
Maybe we cannot define the all good.
Okay.
Maybe in this sentence, the good means not the traditional good.
Okay. Maybe we have to change our definition of what it means to have an all good God.
Yeah.
Okay. Or maybe we have to change the definition of what it means to be an all powerful God, right? So these are some of the things that people have tried to talk about. So it's interesting that in the Warburton reading, he says that the problem of evil is the most serious challenge to belief in the theist God. So that's an interesting statement. That's a very interesting statement, because basically, if we're able to address this problem, then maybe most people wouldn't have a problem with a belief in God. If we can't, if this really is demonstrated very strongly that this is a serious problem that cannot be overcome, then maybe people who believe in God really should stop believing in God, right? So this is an interesting crux of a question, and we're going to be looking at that in more detail. So what are some of the proposed solutions that Warburton goes over in terms of the belief in God? Now, you guys have given me some of them here, and we'll be able to discuss them. These are also called theodicies. So what a theodicy is a defense of God's goodness, trying to show that God is actually good. And here are some of the answers. You have saintliness. So what does that mean? Well, okay, have you guys heard of Mother Teresa before? Okay. Mother Teresa was a woman who gave her life to helping poor people in India. So she came from Europe, and she was a Catholic nun, and she would help people who are dying to be able to get off of the streets, and she wouldn't be able to necessarily help them get the medical attention they needed, because they were usually gone too far before she was able to help them. But she was at least able to give them a clean bath, a place to rest, and then eventually to die. And she also, I think, did other things as well in terms of helping just poor people in general. But those were some of the things she did. So one of the arguments is, in order for people like Mother Teresa to exist, or you can think of as other heroes, like in Chinese culture, there's certain heroes who have gone out of their way to help other people, right? And so in order for those heroes to exist, you would have to have some evil to exist. And so that's one of the arguments. There's another argument, that's the artistic analogy, that when you're doing a painting or you're doing a musical composition, it can't all be the high notes in the composition. It can't all be the harmonies in music. When you're doing a painting, a very dramatic painting, you're going to have some maybe contrasts that are dark. It's not just always light and beautiful, right? There might be some things that are a little bit ugly that you would put in a painting. And so some people use this argument to combat the problem of evil, and they say, well, see, God is like a composer, or like a musical composer. So there's going to be, in some of the music, there's going to be some dissonance, and in a painting, there's going to be some ugliness that will come out, but that will make the beauty even more contrastive, right? So there's some problems with these arguments, right? Like, so the saintliness argument, from Warburton's perspective, it's kind of hard to accept, because why would you have so much evil just to have a few people be saints or heroes? It seems a little bit absurd. Another thing about the artistic analogy is that, it seems a little bit like it's making God into some sort of psychopath that would have to make so many people suffer, like somebody who makes a bomb and it explodes in a place, and they just they get excited. They watch the explosion, they see things being destroyed, they see blood and guts flying everywhere, and it makes them very happy. That's what we call a psychopath, right? So maybe these aren't such great arguments, right? And then there's one of the defenses against this is called the free will defense. Now, what is the free will defense? Did you guys understand what the free will defense is? Would you be able to have free will and also no evil? So if there's if nobody has a choice to do evil, are they truly free to make choices at all? So what would be some criticisms of that free will defense? And that is the assumption that a world with free will and the possibility of evil is preferable to a world of robot-like people who never perform evil actions. So this is a good question for you guys. Here's a question. What would you, if you only had two choices, what would you choose? To be able to be free to make the decisions that you want to make, or to be a robot and have no suffering? So you could be a robot that has no suffering, but you have to do exactly what you've been programmed to do, or would you rather be able to choose whatever you want, but have the possibility of making mistakes, of having suffering, and so on? What would you rather have?
Free man.
The second one is these pre-programmed beings could have been designed so that they believed they had free will, even though they didn't. They could have the illusion of free will with the benefits that follow from thinking that they are free and none of the drawbacks. What about that? What about that as a possibility? What do you think if people could just have the illusion of being free will and not really have free will? Would that be good? Would that be a good solution? So to me, Warburton kind of fails here. Like, if he really is arguing these things, maybe he's just trying to bring up these arguments. But if anyone's going to take these things seriously, I find it kind of, you can think it through a little bit more and see that there's some problems with it. Actually, this is a very popular, you'll find this in science. A lot of people that study the brain, neuroscientists and psychologists, come to these conclusions. Now, you have to look at the details of their argumentation. Oftentimes they will say they're basing it on experimentation, but often they're basing it on a metaphysical perspective, really, that they're bringing to their experimentation. But so some psychologists believe that, but I would say most philosophers don't think that there is no free will. Most philosophers would say they think there is free will. But in any case, it's not about the most of who thinks what. It's about what's the most reasonable thing. That's what we should be looking at. What's most reasonable and what's verifiable and demonstratable as far as it can be verified and demonstrated. And I don't know how much science experiments on the brain can show us whether or not we have free will. That's a good question to actually pose. Could God just intervene with the evil that's going on?
Miracle.
Miracles, right. Why doesn't God just use miracles all the time to stop the evil that's going on? Just to ask him to make some interventions more often, that seems like he should do that, right? It seems that God should intervene more. So this is a big problem. I would say this is a valid argument. So next we're going to look at Feser's response. But if we just go back to that for a second about the intervention, I don't think that's an argument against the existence of God. I think that's an argument about if God exists, then why doesn't he intervene? And we're going to see how Feser does this. He divides these questions into, is evil's existence consistent with God's existence? And why does God allow evil to exist? So the why does God allow evil to exist question is actually what we would call a theodicy. So we mentioned that in the book, there's the theodicy. Feser makes it very clear there's actually two parts of this. There's a defense part and there's a theodicy part. Okay? And if you're going to talk about God intervening, then you're already talking about why does God allow evil to exist, which assumes that there's a God. If you're asking why does God allow evil to exist, you're assuming that there's a God. You don't need to answer that question if you don't assume there's a God, right? But the first question doesn't assume there's a God. It's asking, does God exist? And so is the concept of evil existing simultaneously to God existing consistent with each? Is that whole two parts actually consistent? Can they consistently coexist? And I don't think miracles and intervention are part of that first question. So it's good that these are separate questions, and we're only going to focus on the first one, because the second one would take a lot of time, and it's not really talking about God's existence as much as it's addressing why God would allow that to happen. And then Feser makes this distinction between a defense and a theodicy, which a defense is just defending God's existence. Theodicy is trying to show that God is still good. Okay, so there is this philosopher by the name of J.L. Mackie. Okay, J.L. Mackie once argued as follows: God is supposed to be omnipotent and perfectly good, but there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, and a good thing will eliminate evil as far as it can. So if God exists, then he would be able to eliminate all evil and would want to do so. But evil still exists. So either God is not really omnipotent, not really perfectly good, or he does not exist at all. Okay, so take a look at this argument and think about it. Is there any problem with this argument? Fazer had a different issue with this. He said the problem he has with this is the second line, but there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, and a good thing will eliminate evil as far as it can. So there's a problem with this. This is his problem. Is it true, without qualifications, that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do? Or are there some limits, in other words? Are there some limits to what an all-powerful being can do? It seems, to Fazer at least, God can't do something that would be logically incoherent. He can't do these types of things. There is a famous thing that people often ask, so is God all-powerful? And people say, yes, God's all-powerful. So can God make a boulder bigger than he can carry? Can God make a boulder bigger than he can carry? What do you think? Can God make a boulder? So you're kind of saying yes. You're saying God could make a boulder bigger than he can carry. But then you have to ask, so is then God still omnipotent? Is he still powerful? Because he can't lift that thing that's too big for him. Is he still all powerful? Does that make him no longer all powerful?
No longer powerful.
Is he no longer powerful? If he makes it,
can't hold a board.
okay. And what do you think, Shin?
I think so.
You also think? Okay, so the point is that's a little different than because that's actually logic. It's logical that I could make something bigger than I can carry, right? It's not logical that you can make a round square, but it is logical that you can make something bigger than you can carry. So the contradiction, though, becomes with the all-powerful. And so the question is, are there just limitations that are inbuilt, one, logically, and two, in a way that would cancel out the original purposes that God had, or original being that he is? So it doesn't seem, according to Fazer at least, it doesn't seem like it would be worthwhile or even logical to explore the possibilities of God being able to cancel kind of himself out. So another one would be, can God just kill himself, right? Because if God is all alive forever and ever and ever, does he have enough ability, with all his abilities to be able to stop his own life? Does he have the ability to stop his own life? Anyways, you can go on and on with these kinds of problems, but I think the point that we should come back to here is that from Fazer's perspective, we probably need to have some limitations on this idea of omnipotent, because there's some things, at least, if you're taking his perspective, that you can't do no matter what you are, because there's just a limitation to that thing, like a round square. So are some goods only possible? So you can make this by analogy, is then ask, are some good things that are possible only possible if there's an existence of evil also? And can you think of some examples? What would be some examples of things that are only possible to be good if there's also evil present? And if there was no evil, those things wouldn't be good anymore. If some evil must be tolerated to allow for certain goods, then God would have to allow evil to exist in order for those goods to exist, right? Yeah. Must a good thing eliminate all evil as far as it can? Some of the things that I could think of that would be, they're only able to exist if evil exists. For example, courage. You would not need to be brave ever if there wasn't any possibility of something evil, if it was natural or not natural, happening, right? Courage requires that there has to be some evil in existence, either human choices or natural events. What about forgiveness? There only is a need for forgiveness if people do wrong things. And wrong things can only happen if there's some evil in the world. What about mercy? To show mercy. What about compassion? If you want to show compassion to somebody, the only way to show that compassion is because you have, an understanding that there's some sort of evil that's happened to that person, right? And so there has to be some evil that is in existence in order for compassion to be.
You see that the bad things like the evil or disasters is a way that encourage people to do some good things.
Right. So to get rid of some evils may entail also getting rid of the goods that presuppose those evils. That's an example. So I showed this video clip of this girl seeing somebody that was only eating bread and water and bringing some KFC to him. And in that situation, the only reason that's good is because there's something bad, which is hunger and maybe not getting proper nutrition. And those things which are kind of an evil, the only reason that giving somebody food and having compassion on somebody and demonstrating that kind of goodness is good is because there's some sort of evil that exists. So even if a good thing could get rid of those evils, it might refrain from doing so to ensure that the goods in question are preserved. That's what Fazer comes to an example he gives is with like a child's homework. So let's say my kid has homework to do, and I tell him, don't worry about it, just don't do your homework, right? For the teacher. He's complaining. I'm like, okay, just don't do it. Don't do your homework. Now, is it kind of suffering for the kid to do his homework? It's a kind of like suffering, right? No, maybe not. Maybe it is. Maybe for my kids, sometimes it seems like they're suffering when they have to do. They'd rather play than to do their homework. But the thing is actually it's necessary that they do their homework. They will only benefit from that kind of suffering. In the end, the greater good is that they will actually learn and have things that they will come to an appreciation of as a result of doing the things that their teacher asked them to do. And it would be wrong of me to just get rid of that. Now, from their perspective, it doesn't make sense. We should just get rid of all homework. There shouldn't be any of that work to do. But from my perspective, it's good that they do their homework. And it will be good. They'll see that it's good maybe sometime later in their life. Now, that's kind of I don't want to make suffering trivial as a result of agreeing with that example. And I don't think Phaser is either. I don't think Phaser is making suffering trivial just by stating that. It's just trying to show an analogy to a possibility that these things that are horrible that happen could have a greater good come out of them. So Mackey's argument fails, according to Phaser, because of this. It doesn't stand the test of logic. And actually, Mackey himself admits in one of his books, he admits, we cannot indeed take the problem of evil as a conclusive disproof of traditional theism. And he's an atheist. And that's what his conclusion was. So what is the evidential argument from evil? Okay, the evidential argument from evil is this. Even if the existence of evil does not strictly disprove theism, it still makes it probable that there is no God. So this is just an idea that, okay, we can't disprove it, but it still is probable that there is no God. William Rowe has an argument, is that an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being would prevent any suffering that could be prevented without losing a greater good or bringing about some equally bad or worse evil. But two, it is probable that at least some of the suffering that actually exists in the world could have been prevented without losing a greater good or bringing about some equally bad or worse evil. 3, therefore, it is probable that there is no omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being. Okay, so what are the problems with that? Well, first of all, before we go into the problems, we should talk about an example that Rowe gives. So he talks about, say you have a deer, a little baby deer. It's very cute, innocent, nice, running around in the forest, and all of a sudden there's a lightning strike, and the lightning causes a fire, and that poor little baby deer starts to burn. And he suffers, and he's hurting, and he's laying there, and nobody knows about this baby deer, and he's suffering, and eventually the baby deer dies. Okay, but he suffered a very, very long time. And Rowe's example, the reason Rowe chose this example is he says, it seems kind of absurd to think that kind of suffering would lead to some sort of greater good. So when we're talking about humans, and you think, okay, there's human suffering, maybe you can imagine there's some sort of greater good that's going to come out of it. But surely for some animal that nobody even knows about, that's out there suffering, and it's such an innocent, cute little animal, and it's suffering, can there really be any greater good that comes out of that? What do you guys think? Can there be any greater good that comes out of some suffering from some innocent animal? Can you be absolutely sure that there is no greater good that can come from that? Can you be absolutely sure?
No.
Okay, so if you can't be absolutely sure, then still that leaves a possibility that some good could come out of it, right? So Rowe claims that it is more rational, though, to not believe in God because of examples like this. So this would be an example where Rowe would say, then therefore God must not exist. If those kinds of situations happen, there's enough suffering to rule God out, but this situation, we can definitely rule God out. This is Phaser's answer. It can be rational to believe this, that there is no God, only if we don't already have independent reasons to think that God exists, and thus independent reasons to think that there must be some greater good that God withdraw out of instances of suffering, like the one cited by Rowe. So, in other words, it's only rational if you don't already have independent reasons. If you have independent reasons to believe in God, then you just have to ask the second question, which would require a theodicy, not a defense. Remember how we had a theodicy and defense and the differences there. So he's saying this objection actually only makes sense if you've run out of reasons to believe in God. It's not just that we happen not to know of every instance of evil that was supposed to be evil that exists. What the reasons are why God allows it. That we don't know is precisely what we should expect. The point that Phaser was trying to make in that last slide is that if we have some other reasons to believe that there's a greater good, that could be embedded in other things. For example, is the soul immortal? So this kind of gets beyond just arguments for or against God. Is that if the soul is immortal, then it could be possible that everything could be compensated for in the afterlife. So in other words, it could be given back, like there could be, and which makes sense, right? Because it would be absurd to assume that it couldn't if there's an eternal soul. So for example, so right now, your life is maybe 70, 80, 90 years, maybe longer. Maybe you live to 100. So that seems like a long time, right? 100 years. But what if you're going to live for infinity years? Like you'll die, but your soul continues for infinity years. How long will 100 years seem? Yeah, will it seem very long? Will 100 years of life here, even if it was suffering every moment for 100 years, would that seem, it would seem very small, right? So the point being that if your life seems really small in comparison to infinity or eternity, then surely that good life that you're supposed to have in eternity would be a compensation for the small portion of life that we're going through right now, even though it seems really long. So it's a matter of perspective, if that's true. Now, you might not accept that. You might not accept there is an immortality of the soul, or that there's some sort of eternity, or that eternity would be good. But this is similar to the fact that we can't always understand things, and we can't understand anything really about eternity because we don't, or the afterlife, because we don't experience the afterlife right now. It's similar to a child who's trying to understand adulthood, according to Fazer. He can't understand adulthood because he hasn't entered adulthood. So he doesn't know what it is like to be an adult. And to go through what you go through as a child to become an adult could seem like a lot of suffering for nothing, unless you actually could know what it's like to be an adult and what that would bring about as a result of it. But the last thing we're going to discuss just before we finish class, and we need to finish a little bit early today, is the gambler's argument, which is by a guy named Blaise Pascal. He's one of my favorite philosophers, actually, Blaise Pascal. Have you heard of him before? Blaise Pascal. Now, he lived roughly 400 or so years ago, and he had some very interesting things. Actually, you might know if you do computer. Are you guys, any of you guys doing programming? Computer programming is your major. So there was a language that was a computer language that was named Pascal, right? Actually, in Leibniz, yesterday or 2 days ago when we studied about the principle of sufficient reason, that came from Leibniz, who was one of the calculus guys. And you guys are both studying calculus too, right? So founders of calculus. So, but Pascal, actually, he was one of the first people to invent something that was similar to an automated computing. A machine that was like, so he actually came up with some complicated mathematical theorems as well. But here is his kind of argument for God's existence. And it's not so much an argument for God's existence as it is a argument that it's reasonable to make a leap of faith or to decide that you will take an action in believing God. And it goes like this. Okay, if you believe in God, and so two things could happen. One, God doesn't exist. The other is that God does exist. If God doesn't exist, you aren't disappointed. So he says, in that situation, believing in God in your life, in this situation, you lose nothing. You lose nothing. So no God, lose nothing. But say there is a God, and you believe in God. Well, then you gain everything, because you got God in this life, and you got God in the next life, and everything that goes with that, and so you gain everything. So that's one scenario. Now say you have another scenario, that you do not believe in God. So you can say, so in this situation, no belief in God would lead us to what? You also don't gain anything, you don't lose anything. So you gain nothing. And this is also gain nothing. And lose nothing. This is also gain nothing and lose nothing. Right? But if there's God, then you lose everything. Which one, no belief or belief, which one has the safest bet? If you're going to take a bet, which one is the safest choice? Is it no belief or is it belief? Belief. Why?
Because if you choose no belief in God, you will like no matter what you choose, you will lose. But if you choose to believe in God, you lose anything, but you gain something.
Right. This is logic. This is just logical. Okay, and that's what Blaise Pascal was trying to point out. Not so much he's trying to use it. If you read Blaise Pascal, you see he's not using it to try to convince people to believe God, but it's to try to show that actually then it's a really logical decision. You might as well just believe there's a God, because I mean, if it's only for the purposes of your afterlife. Now, I don't think that's a good recommendation. Actually, Warburton also says that seems very disingenuous. It's not like a genuine motivation to believe in God. But sometimes I like to return to this just to remember that this is an interesting problem. So Warburton, obviously, he points out some other things. Do you guys remember from the reading what else Warburton pulls out? He thinks that this argument's invalid, but I actually find it a very valid argument, because I think it's not a motivation. If you don't look at it as a motivation for belief in God, but just as from the standpoint of it's logical to still believe in God. From the standpoint of a gambler taking a bet, your higher bet is still on that God would exist. Now, I think Warburton basically is trying to say, though, that it seems like a very selfish way of being kind of motivated very selfishly. It all has to do with your own gaining. So I think each person has to kind of consider that argument on their own and see, is that something that connects with them or not? And I find it actually still quite a convincing argument, even though I don't think it's a good motivation to, necessarily to believe in God. But it could be helpful just to be able to think about, because it allows you to see that there is some rationale